Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most arresting, provocative, and just absolutely monumental works in the entire history of art. I'm talking about Théodore Géricault's masterpiece, The Raft of the Medusa. Now, you have to understand, this isn't just a painting about a shipwreck. Not at all. It's really a story of deep obsession, a genuinely grim descent into the macabre, and an artist who was completely determined to force his society to stare right at a horrifying truth. So we're going to visually dissect exactly how Géricault constructed this scene piece by piece and figure out why it permanently changed the trajectory of art forever. Let's get into it. To really grasp the impact of this painting, we first have to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the disaster itself. 150. That is the number of people who were essentially piled onto a hastily constructed, barely seaworthy wooden raft back in July of 1816. The French naval frigate Medusa had run aground off the coast of West Africa, and well, there simply weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. So the lower-ranking crew and passengers were forced onto this makeshift raft. It was so completely overcrowded that the very moment it was loaded, it partially submerged right under the weight of the terrified people on board. Just imagine that panic. 13. That's the number of agonizing days those people were left entirely adrift at sea. See, the initial plan was actually for the lifeboats to tow the raft to safety, but after just a few miles, those tow ropes were cut, or maybe they broke, and the raft was just abandoned. For survival, for sustenance, the 150 people on board had exactly one bag of ship's biscuits. And yeah, that was completely eaten on the very first day. Other than that, they just had some casks of wine. And here is the final, incredibly grim statistic for you. 15. Out of the 150 people forced onto that raft, only 15 men actually survived to be rescued. Over the course of those 13 days, that raft basically became a floating hell. Driven completely mad by dehydration, by starvation, and by absolute terror, the men mutinied. They murdered each other, and ultimately they resorted to cannibalism just to stay alive. It was a literal descent into the absolute darkest extremes of human experience. Okay, so part 1, the Medusa disaster, a true crime tragedy at sea. We can pretty easily trace this rapid descent into horror. The Medusa ran aground on July 2nd, 1816, and by July 5th, the raft was totally abandoned. It wasn't until July 17th that the survivors were finally rescued by the ship Argus, and honestly, that was largely by chance. Now, what made this an absolute massive public embarrassment for the newly restored French Bourbon monarchy was how the crash happened in the first place. You see, the disaster was widely blamed on the sheer incompetence of the ship's captain, Hugues de Roy de Chaumeries. He was a returned royalist émigré who had barely sailed a ship in 20 years. Yet, he was given command of the frigate mostly through political preference. So the public was just outraged. They saw the whole tragedy as a direct, undeniable result of official corruption and ineptitude. Which brings us to part 2, Anatomy of an Obsession, Géricault's macabre studio. Entered the artist. A 27-year-old French painter named Théodore Géricault looked at this explosive international scandal and saw the perfect, shocking subject to launch his career. But his preparations for this painting, they bordered on absolute obsession. He acted almost like an early investigative journalist, or honestly like a highly dedicated true crime podcaster today. He actually tracked down and interviewed 2 of the traumatized survivors, the surgeon, Savigny, and the engineer, Corriard. He even worked directly with the ship's surviving carpenter to build a highly detailed exact-scale model of the raft right inside his studio. But then, things got deeply, deeply macabre. To make sure the flesh of the dead bodies in his painting looked perfectly authentic, he set up his studio near the hospital Beaujon just to study the faces of dying patients. I'm serious. He went to morgues, brought severed limbs back to his studio to watch them decay, and he even kept a severed head, which he borrowed from a lunatic asylum, on his studio roof for 2 whole weeks. He actually shaved his own head and lived this weird monastic existence, locking himself away for months just to complete the work. All right, part 3. Composing the raft. Let's do a visual dissection of this masterpiece. So, taking to a massive canvas. We are talking 16 by 23 feet here, folks. Géricault did tons of sketches trying to figure out which exact moment of that 13-day ordeal he actually wanted to depict. He thought about painting the mutiny. He considered the cannibalism or even the final rescue itself. But instead, he chose this brutal moment of agonizing false hope. He chose the exact second the survivors spotted the rescue ship, the Argus, way out on the horizon, only to watch it just pass them by. As one survivor described it, from the delirium of joy, we fell into profound despondency and grief. The ship wouldn't actually come back for another 2 hours. So Géricault purposefully chose the absolute emotional precipice of the entire tragedy. And to naturally lead our eye right through that specific emotion, Géricault brilliantly structures the painting using 2 overlapping pyramids. Start looking at the bottom left. Here, we see this heavy foundation of death. The foreground is literally littered with dead and dying figures, painted almost twice life-size, so they're pushing right out into our personal space as viewers. Then, if you follow the bodies of the survivors, there's this surge of hope, a physical diagonal movement pushing upward and over to the right. And this culminates at the emotional apex, where you have a figure standing on a barrel, frantically waving a cloth at a tiny, almost invisible speck on the horizon. The entire composition physically pulls you from the depths of despair at the bottom straight up to a desperate, straining hope at the very top. To really amplify that tension, Géricault uses light and line like a master. He uses what art historians call Caravagesque lighting, which basically means deep, highly dramatic contrasts between the dark shadows and the stark light. His color palette is purposely muted, relying heavily on pallid flesh tones, muddy browns, and dark greens for the ocean. He deliberately avoids using any bright blues. And beyond those pyramids we just talked about, check out the 2 distinct opposing diagonal lines. One diagonal pushes your eye along the mast and the rigging, pointing down toward a massive threatening wave on the left. That symbolizes despair and the crushing power of nature. But the other diagonal follows the reaching arms of the survivors, pushing up toward the right, reaching for salvation. It is a literal visual tug-of-war happening right there on the canvas. Now, the painting also served as a highly deliberate political statement. Look back at the very top of that pyramid of hope. The figure waving the rag is a black crew member named Jean-Charles. Géricault, who held very strong abolitionist views, hired a well-known Haitian art model named Joseph to pose for this figure. You have to remember, in European art at the time, black figures were rarely, if ever, placed as the active central hero of a monumental history painting. So by elevating an ordinary black sailor to the absolute pinnacle of the composition, and by depicting a contemporary disaster caused by aristocratic incompetence, Géricault was offering a really stark indictment of post-Napoleonic French officialdom. He used the canvas to impartially force his viewers to confront both the horrors of the slave trade and the devastating failures of the new government all at once.
Let's wrap things up with part 4, Romanticism's Radical Legacy, Breaking the Mold.
So why does this matter? Well, this specific painting effectively built a bridge to a totally new era of art. At the time, the dominant artistic style was neoclassicism. Think calm, highly ordered, beautifully idealized heroes, usually depicting classical myths or religious themes. Géricault took the grand scale and the muscular figures from that neoclassical tradition, but he completely shattered the rules. His painting was turbulent, it was dark, and most importantly, it featured ordinary, unidealized people dying in a contemporary, highly political event. There is absolutely no stoic, perfect hero here. There's only raw human suffering and the desperate will to survive. This painting essentially marks the dramatic birth of the Romantic movement in French painting. And the visceral power of Géricault's work, it had an immediate impact on his peers. Take Eugène Delacroix, for example. He was a friend of Géricault's and actually modeled face down for one of the dead figures in the foreground. Delacroix would go on to become the standard bearer for French Romanticism himself. He wrote about seeing this painting while it was still in progress, and he said, "It made so tremendous an impression on me that when I came out of the studio, I started running like a madman and did not stop till I reached my own room." That is how mind-blowing this piece was at the time. So the immense legacy this painting left behind really cannot be overstated. When it debuted at the 1819 Paris Salon, it predictably divided critics right down political lines. But then it found a massive commercial success a year later when it toured in London, drawing in over 40,000 visitors. Tragically, Géricault wouldn't live long enough to see his full influence unfold. He died just a few years later at the incredibly young age of 32. Shortly after his death, the Louvre acquired the painting, where it still dominates an entire gallery space to this very day. Its willingness to show brutal, unfiltered reality paved the way not just for Romanticism, but for the later realists and modern artists. It heavily influenced legends like Turner, Courbet, Manet, and Rodin. It essentially birthed the modern idea that art must confront brutal truths head-on. Which leaves us with this final, profound question to think about. How exactly does a painter reconcile a hideous, gruesome reality with powerful, enduring art?
Géricault stared into the absolute darkest depths of human depravity, madness, and political failure, and somehow he translated it into a monument of endurance that we still cannot look away from 2 centuries later. He proved once and for all that art doesn't have to be pretty to be beautiful, and it certainly doesn't need an idealized hero to be truly heroic. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning everything and always keep looking deeper.